another tactic we want to take a look at using the liberal radical lens is education. So in general, if you're looking at education as the end to change, rather than as a stepping stone towards building a larger struggle that will fundamentally alter material conditions of power, then education can be said to be more liberal. For example, a lot of liberals tend to think that if we just educate the children correctly, then when they grow up and enter positions of power, they will slowly but surely shift the entire culture away from its destructive path. This is intensely liberal because this kind of thinking maintains the naturalness of current systems of power. The system that still relies on production, extraction, securing resources, and so on is usually still a normalized part of the equation. Another example of this might be business trainings that teach women how to climb corporate ladders into executive positions, which is liberal because it doesn't get to the root of why women as a class are marginalized and subordinated in the first place.
May I ask you to speak up again, please?
You can.
Thank you.
I will try. It maintains the naturalness of patriarchy because it doesn't challenge the existence of inherently patriarchal institutions of industry and capitalism. In most liberal or progressive attempts to empower women, patriarchy and the structured oppression of women is still in the equation. If education is not about fundamentally shifting the distribution of power or physically dismantling systems of oppression, then it is liberal. Liberals tend to put a high value on rational argument. But the problem is that we're not going to be able to rationally argue our way out of racism, sexism, misogyny, xenophobia, and so on. These are not simply attitudes that can be educated out of us. They are entrenched, interlocking systems of power that need to be physically dismantled. Now, Sam already mentioned something similar, but we know that a major trait of liberal education is the naming of individuals as the primary movers and shakers of social change, failing to acknowledge that the group and the class throughout history have been the social units that are able to fundamentally change society. And so what happens to an environmental movement when individualism is emphasized? Well, you'll probably hear phrases like change starts at home, or more nauseating ones like be green, buy eco-friendly underwear, or the gamut. Statements like this epitomize liberalism, and this worldview is harmful, we believe, because it serves to keep the blinders up, the blinders to power, and its use in large-scale systems of domination. And so another way to put what I'm trying to say is that education that takes power out of the equation is generally liberal. And since we're talking about power being used to dominate people and the planet, to extract labor, resources, and so on, any education that promotes denial of domination or accommodation of domination or consent to domination is also liberal. So, as radicals, we do believe in the necessity of education. But that education has got to be strategic, and it's got to be put towards a goal of transforming material conditions from those of subordination to those of justice. We think education is most useful if it's used to calibrate individuals so they fit into a larger movement or larger structure. This often means giving people more tools to work with as they all work together towards a similar goal. And an example of that might be a Know Your Rights training, or a security culture training, direct action training, media training, and so on. Education is also useful if it names power and prepares to confront that power with a coherent strategy.
So we're all here at the Environmental Law Conference. I should probably talk about legal tactics a little bit. So we're all probably a little bit familiar with how legal tactics have been used in the current environmental movement in ways that have been extremely effective and also ways that have been not so effective. To be clear, when I talk about legal tactics, I'm not just talking about tactics that fall in the arena of what is legal or what's sanctioned by the law. What I'm talking about is tactics that utilize the law as a tool for creating material change. And so legal tactics can look like anything from passing new legislation to bringing lawsuits against corrupt industries, to voting, or to lobbying people in power. And historically, as I said, they've kind of run the gamut from being really effective to being necessarily restrictive and piecemeal. And also because many liberals have kind of sanctioned legal tactics as the only legitimate means for creating material change, a lot of radicals have just scorned the tactic altogether. But it's important to say that legal tactics are not just for liberals. Through the course of history, there have been legislative victories and court rulings that have substantially changed people's lives and redirected the flow of power. So if we are going to try and reorganize power in the society, we know we're going to have to grapple with the legal system in one way or another. The trick is learning how to use the legal system as radicals. So I'm going to go over some of the tactics, the legal tactics that have been used in this movement and try and look at how they've been used in various liberal or radical ways. So the first is regulation. The law has often been used to regulate or to check unjust activities on the part of individuals or corporate entities. And the most common subject of regulation is usually egregious industrial waste in the form of toxins, which are being released into the air or the water, or solid waste released onto the land or sometimes on the ocean floors. And we're all probably familiar here with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the various pesticide and herbicide regulations that have basically all set standards for acceptable levels of toxins that can be released into our environment. And a lot of people consider these acts pretty radical. And I have to say that they have substantially reduced the amount of toxins released into the environment, especially in comparison to what things would be like if they weren't in place. However, legal regulatory tactics are only effective insofar as those who are in charge of doing the regulating are actually doing their job. And this becomes a real problem when those who are in charge of regulating are the government or the corporations who are doing the pollution themselves. And so what we're left is like all of these loopholes created to accommodate the corporations so that they can just continue polluting as much as they need to make their profit. And with a regulatory structure like this, I'm not sure how people were surprised when fracking was granted immunity from the Clean Water Act.
Really?
Or when the Clean Air Act was left powerless in reducing greenhouse gases. And the obvious conclusion of this is that regulation, faulty regulation, has left 40% of US rivers and 46% of US lakes too polluted to support aquatic life. And at the same time, it's left the air so polluted that 23 million people are dying a year from air pollution-related diseases. I don't think anyone in this room would argue that those are acceptable levels of toxins. The same kind of faulty regulatory practices have been used to manage prairies, woodlands, and grasslands in ways that are pretty literally missing the forest for the trees here. If you're at this conference, you've probably heard a panel or two about the state of our forests today. Reformist wilderness management has been leaving forests gutted and amputated before slaughtered wholesale and clear cuts. And it's been like this since the beginning. Since the very beginning of wilderness management, it's served the people who want to extract resources, not the wilderness and the living systems itself. We can see this looking at the first wilderness bill, the very first wilderness bill, passed in 1964. What it did was it designated specific areas of land spared from industrial expansion, which is seriously backwards in my opinion. And then it allowed for a certain level of acceptable extraction to happen on those spared pieces of land. So again, the logical conclusion of this is that 95% of the old growth forests in this country are completely gone. So while most liberal activists are left wondering how to tighten regulation around industrial pollution, logging, and sexual violence, as radicals, our job is to be asking the deeper questions. When did it become acceptable to drink and breathe in any level of synthetic poison? And how is clear-cutting any percentage of living, breathing ecosystems justifiable? As radicals, we should recognize that no level of destruction and oppression is acceptable, and we should be working to stop all of it, not merely lessen its blows. So aside from creating legislation which serves to regulate, legal tactics are often concerned with putting pressure on people in power through methods such as lobbying, petitioning, calling, or writing representatives. One big problem with this is that, as many of us know, you can't convince insane people like this guy behind me. And to get more to the point, though, you can't convince people to stop destroying the natural world if they are directly responsible for upholding a system which necessitates that destruction. So if you remember the liberal radical chart, you'll remember that social reality is not just thoughts and ideas, it's material situations, material circumstances. And the current political structure that we're in right now is predicated on the material condition of infinite growth, which means the material condition of continuous resource consumption and imperialistic expansion. And so we're not going to convince people in power to stop burning fossil fuels or tearing apart forests, because they simply can't undermine this system that they are responsible for upholding. That's their job. It goes against their job description to ask them otherwise. So in the same vein, voting new people into the same corrupt positions of power isn't going to get us anywhere either. Hopefully everyone in this room knows that voting a new president into power isn't going to solve the current environmental crisis. So maybe instead of putting so much energy into trying to convince people in power to just change their ways or to put new people into the same fundamentally corrupt positions, we should be considering how to use the law as radicals and redistributing power back to the people. So whether this means giving marginalized classes more political leverage, like the Civil Rights Act did, or giving individuals more control over their own lives, like Roe v. Wade did, Radical legislation seeks to empower oppressed classes and check their oppressors. So, of course, there are many circumstances where we're going to have to put pressure on people in power. They do have the power, and we are going to have to ask them in one way or another to wield it in less destructive ways, oftentimes. But it's important to say that we don't have to just use legal means to do this. For instance, the suffragettes had to convince those in power to give them the vote. So for generations, they asked really nicely. They protested, they just pleaded, and it didn't work. And so then they turned to tactics like hunger strikes, like civil disobedience campaigns, and finally they turned to arson before finally winning the vote. And so the moral of the story here is that...
Whoa. I like that one.
The moral of the story is that if you have no political leverage, then your best bet at winning is to engage in disruption, or moving the terrain of conflict outside of electoral politics or the bureaucratic process. And we'll get more into these disruptive tactics later, but for now, it's important to say that we simply don't have to turn always to legislative means to winning legal battles. Okay, and the final way that we can measure the effectiveness of legal tactics is by looking at the grander picture and considering whether the tactic supports a larger campaign or a larger resistance movement. So this would be one of the circumstances in which our categories of tactics overlap in really crucial and really effective ways. If a legal tactic can't be decisive all on its own, then what it can do is it can aim to support other tactics happening at the same time. So the work that the Civil Liberties Defense Center does is an excellent example of how this happens. Those of us who live in the Northwest know how indispensable their work is. We need people who know how to navigate the legal system because whether we like it or not, the legal system is what we're going to be dealing with when we necessarily break the law to achieve justice. And if we don't have organizations like CLDC to defend activists, then we will not have anyone doing the work. Another really great example is the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Right now, they're working on drafting an amazing part of an ordinance which is a support for direct action resistors, which basically makes it legal for people engaging in direct action to do so to enforce these ordinances, and makes it illegal for any public or private entity to bring a lawsuit against these resistors. So that's a really truly revolutionary movement between legal and direct action tactics. So overall, when we're talking about legal tactics, we should really be asking the following 3 questions. 1, are regulatory acts changing material circumstances in a meaningful way, or are they merely attempting to reform a fundamentally destructive process? 2, are we putting faith into necessarily flawed positions of power, or are we redistributing power to communities to give them control over their own lives? And 3, is this effort supporting a larger resistance movement?
All right. So another thing we want to talk about using this lens is direct action. When we talk about direct action, we have to remember that no single action is definitively liberal or radical. If we're going to build a serious resistance movement, we need to understand that. If our actionists are on the inside or the outside, it really doesn't matter. The important thing to remember is that we need it all. Whatever way we decide to take action, we need to choose those actions based on where power is vulnerable compared to the resources at hand. Or in other words, where we are strong and they are weak. What we need then is strategy. But before we talk about strategy, we have to talk about goals. And for our purposes here, this is how I sometimes like to talk about our goals. If someone is sick, and they are host to some kind of nasty parasite that is making them sick, you're not going to be able to cure the symptoms unless you first get rid of the parasite. That seems pretty obvious. We apply this same understanding to the big picture. For humans to help the earth even start the process of healing, we have to get rid of whatever it is that is making the earth sick, whatever it is that is causing every indicator of ecological health to plummet. And if we continue using this metaphor, looking at the big picture, we see the entire industrial economy as that parasitic growth. This comparison is not hyperbole. Behaviorally speaking, the industrial economy is behaving like a parasite or even a cancer, because it is taking from the earth in massive quantities and giving nothing back in return, except, of course, poison and toxicity. And this is something that most liberals and progressives rarely factor into their visioning of the future. Any greening of the economy still usually entails taking from the earth way more than giving back, as Sam mentioned earlier. And we can't continue to do that. We cannot continue industrial production, which is a nice way to say the transformation of living communities into dead commodities. Our conviction is that this entire structure of society is irredeemable and has to go, and it has to go as soon as possible. We're not interested in giving the experts a little bit of time to work out all the kinks of a clean, green future. We're not interested in letting more of the earth be sacrificed so that we as humans can figure out how to have a soft landing. What we are interested in is giving the planet a fighting chance to survive, and to do that we need a movement that can bring down the industrial economy.
Yeah.
We've racked our brains and we don't see any viable alternatives to that course of action at this point, given what we're up against. And so, given that explicit goal, now we can talk a little bit about strategy and tactics. So, civil disobedience is probably the most popular tactic taken up by radical direct action groups today. And on the spectrum of action, civil disobedience tactics are rarely ever decisive by themselves. Under the power of the industrial machine we're up against, even the most well-organized, nonviolent civil disobedience campaigns, they're usually just shut down time and time again when the police simply come in and arrest or disperse everyone. In order for people to actually halt something, like a mountaintop removal site or an oil refinery for good, using civil disobedience, we would need an above-ground army of thousands. And that's per site. We would need hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of above-ground resistors to halt the vast array of environmentally destructive projects that are happening right now. Some of us have tried to organize mass actions like this, and those of us who have can say with confidence that we just don't have those kind of numbers. We have to get over the hope that we will ever have a majority and face the fact that any civil disobedience campaign will necessarily be shaping or sustaining a larger movement that has multiple working parts. So while we believe that large-scale civil disobedience campaigns are an important part of an effective social and environmental justice movement, relying on them, as most people seem to be doing, just isn't going to cut it anymore. What we've got to start doing is cultivating the conditions that will allow for effective resistance against critical parts of the industrial economy. Now, of course, we understand that decisive direct actions are nothing new to environmental and social struggles. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Liberation Front, Earth Liberation Front, and some of you have probably looked at other resistance groups of the past, like the Weather Underground, the old IRA, the Red Army faction, or the many other groups which included decisive tactics in their strategies. These groups have caused millions in economic damage to many dominant institutions, and the courage of the individuals involved is unparalleled. But as inspiring as many street protests or earth liberation campaigns have been, especially those that have actually succeeded in causing significant economic damage, we can't deny that the overall outlook for the earth is still dismal, because the industrial economy is still trucking along. And the reason it's still trucking along is because critical nodes of infrastructure, the bottlenecks and choke points of commerce, have not been targeted. So in our minds, what we're going to have to do to bring about the conditions in which this can happen is to build a movement, as they're generally talked about in social theory, where coordinated groups of people put pressure on institutions of power to fundamentally and physically change the material conditions of society. And when that change doesn't happen, those institutions are physically dismantled. We have to be thinking like a resistance movement. When the French were being occupied by the Nazis, members of the resistance knew that they had to take out railroad tracks and bridges. They knew they had to target nodes of critical infrastructure. This is the kind of resistance we're talking about. We're going to have to build a full-fledged movement that will take a strategic path. Fortunately, there are many books and other resources that can help point us towards a more strategic way of thinking about our movements. And I brought one with me, and that's the U.S. Army Operations Manual, the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And there's plenty of Army operations manuals that you can get your hands on. It's public info.
Could you repeat that title?
Yeah, this one is the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And I just want to give you an example of one of these conceptual tools that you can find in one of these books. And this particular book I want to refer to is the Field Manual on Guerrilla Warfare. Again, it's the U.S. Army. And this is something called the Carver matrix. And the Carver matrix is used when you're planning an action. Each letter in the Carver acronym corresponds to a particular criterion to think about. So the C stands for criticality. And when you want to talk about criticality, you're asking how important is the target to the enemy and to enemy operations? Accessibility. How easy is it to get near the target? Then there's return. or recuperability? How much effort would it take to rebuild or replace the target? Vulnerability. How tough is the target? Effect. If the target is successfully destroyed, how widespread will the effect be? And recognizability. Can the target be seen well enough to know the necessary parameters for attack? Is it well hidden? Is it camouflaged? But I think the main question to be asking, I think, is does this action advance our goal of saving the planet, or does it simply answer an emotional need to feel something, to do something? And do our actions fit into a larger strategy, a larger movement? If we want to start thinking strategically, these are all questions we're going to have to be prepared to answer.
So what we're saying may come as a surprise to a lot of you, but we should be clear that advocating for unlawful activity in the name of environmental or social justice is nothing new. We have seen this happening in every single resistance movement throughout history, from the struggle for India's independence, to the civil rights movement, to the American independence movement, to the suffragist struggle, as I already addressed. Unlawful activity in the name of justice has historically come in all forms, from shaping and sustaining actions, like smuggling Jews under the Nazi regime, to slaves in America, making safe houses, or gathering sensitive information. Unlawful activity sometimes looks